I'm Maggie Creech, host of Revolution Revisited. If this podcast has changed how you think about the American Revolution, or just made history come alive again, I'd love your help. Leave a rating or a short review wherever you listen. It only takes a minute, and it helps us amplify Virginia's history, connecting new listeners to the past and supporting the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Thank you for being part of the story.
For 250 years, Virginia's story has been shaped by people from many places and the traditions, ideas, and dreams they've brought with them. We the People, a new exhibition at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, explores the stories of achievement and resilience and communities of those who have immigrated to the Commonwealth. Learn more and get tickets at virginiahistory.org/we the people.
Welcome to Revolution Revisited, your crash course in the American Revolution. As the 250th anniversary of America's independence approaches, dive into the stories of Virginia's rebels, rule breakers, and rabble-rousers who shaped a nation. This podcast is brought to you by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture and made possible by William and Karen Fralin.
Welcome back to Revolution Revisited. I'm your host, Maggie Creech. When most of us picture the American Revolution, we imagine redcoats and patriots colliding in places like Boston or New York, at Valley Forge and Saratoga. But the action goes beyond the Northeast. While those familiar stories were unfolding throughout the 1770s, the war was also taking shape beyond the Appalachian Mountains. On today's episode, we're heading to the backcountry to explore the Illinois Campaign of 1778. Led by Virginian George Rogers Clark. Part military strategist, part land speculator, part frontier celebrity, Clark led a small force into the wilderness and pulled off a massive campaign. To guide us through this Western theater of the war, we are joined by...
My name's Eric Sterner. I'm an independent historian and an author of 3 books on the American Revolution.
The Revolution's Western Front was shaped by competing land claims, ever-evolving relationships with Indigenous nations, and the persistence and ambition of frontier settlers who navigated the chaos of war to fulfill their own interests alongside those of the fledgling nation. Before we get into Clark's campaign, it's worth defining what people meant by the West during the American Revolution. We're not talking about the American West as we know it today. The Western frontier stretched from western Pennsylvania and Virginia into the Ohio River Valley, modern-day Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and parts of the Great Lakes region. This was one of the most contested regions in North America. After the French and Indian War and Pontiac's War, Britain tried to limit westward expansion with the Proclamation Line of 1763. But a series of later treaties opened large portions of Kentucky and the Appalachian frontier to settlement, and colonists poured westward.
So you go back to the French and Indian War ends, we have Pontiac's War. And basically, Pontiac's War is a lot of the Western nations saying we don't want the British or the colonists coming past the crest of the Appalachians. And that's kind of where we get the 1763 proclamation line from King George saying nobody goes west of the Appalachians. The problem is we often forget that subsequent to Pontiac's War, when the British won, there's a series of treaties opening up western Pennsylvania, what's today Western Virginia, West Virginia, and about 2/3 of Kentucky to settlement. So you start to see whites moving across the Appalachians in the western area under the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which gave them the rights, subsequent treaties, and then the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, ironically signed with the Cherokee. They move into Kentucky and more settled areas of western Virginia and western Pennsylvania. The trick here that people don't realize is those treaties were with the Iroquois and the Cherokee. Iroquois claimed to have authority over the land policies and foreign policies of the Indians living in the Ohio country. So we signed treaties, or the British signed treaties with the Iroquois, and nobody talked to people living in the areas of Ohio who hunted in Kentucky. So you've got a situation where the folks moving into this area across the Appalachians, think they have a legal right to it. As far as they're concerned, they've paid for it. They've moved into it. The Iroquois are getting an annuity for it. And the Shawnee, Delaware, the Wyandot, the Miami, folks who prefer to keep Kentucky for themselves, they've got a situation where technically they have given control over their land and foreign policy to the Iroquois because they've lost a series of wars with the Iroquois. But they're farther west now. The Delaware have migrated from the eastern shore out to Ohio. They're feeling a little bit more independent. They don't want to be bound by Iroquois land sales. So you're in this period of weird transition where those Western nations are being more independent from their Iroquois overlords. At the same time, the colonists are becoming more independent from their British overlords. And that creates a mess for conflict.
The treaties had been negotiated with the Iroquois and the Cherokee, who claimed authority over the region, but local nations rejected those claims and wanted to keep Kentucky as a hunting ground. So what we have is a situation where white American settlers believed they had a legal right to the land, while many native nations believed that land had been taken without their consent. To make it more complicated, there were still French throughout the area. The result was a volatile frontier where conflicts over land, sovereignty, and allegiance were already underway as the revolution began to unfold.
In 75 and 76, really the first 2 years of the war, they're neutral. So they're actually being lobbied and enduring diplomatic missions and councils from both the British and the Americans, who are still colonists technically at this point. Both of them, the British and the rebelling Americans, are arguing for neutrality. They're basically saying, look, this is a conflict you don't need to worry about. It's all going to be settled. There'll be an amicable resolution of it, and just remain neutral. So a lot of the nations are doing that, waiting to collect more information and doing their best to find out what's going on. One issue is the Shawnee. The Shawnee live in Ohio. The Shawnee are the ones who basically had Kentucky sold out from underneath them. In 1774, the governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, went to war against the Shawnee because the Shawnee were raiding across the Ohio River into those white settlements in Kentucky, Western Virginia, and Western Pennsylvania, if you want to give the Pennsylvanians credit for it. So Dunmore, the Virginia militia, fight a war against the Shawnee, and Dunmore wins. But not everybody in the Shawnee Nation is reconciled to peace between themselves and Lord Dunmore. So they continue raiding south of the Ohio River. So you got this weird situation where most of the Ohio tribes are saying, we're neutral. They're being told by the Americans and the British that stay neutral. But the Shawnee, some factions in the Shawnee have decided to continue Dunmore's war. So you get violence that's always been a thing on the frontier, ramping up in Kentucky in 1775, 76.
Now that we've gotten some geopolitical context, let's shift our attention to the man who will be at the center of today's campaign, George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark was born in 1752 and was the second of 10 children in a successful but not wealthy Virginia family. You may have heard of his more famous younger brother, William Clark of Lewis and Clark fame. The Clarks were middling planters who owned land and enslaved people, which placed them above subsistence farmers, but well below Virginia's elite. He grew up near Charlottesville, and he received only a year of formal education, which, fun fact, he received from a tutor alongside James Madison. And then he needed to find a practical path to success. And as we know, for ambitious young Virginians of modest means, there was one obvious answer: surveying. If that sounds familiar, it should. Just like another George we know, Clark learned to survey land and headed west in search of opportunity. In 1771, he was in Western Virginia, which is basically today's West Virginia, and by 1772, he's making his way into modern-day Kentucky.
For the first time, in 72, he visits Kentucky, and he's looking for lands all along the Kentucky River, or along the Ohio River, and then down into the Kentucky River, because those are all good land that's relatively easy to acquire. He's loving this area. He thinks it's beautiful, and it's just right for the taking. So he's telling his family in 1772, all through 74 and 75, come move to Kentucky. There's a future here. We can make a future and all sort of make a better place for ourselves in the world. And a lot of them join him eventually. He's a captain in Dunmore's War in 1774. So he's got a little bit of militia experience at the age of 22. He gets to know a lot of the players in Virginia politics because he's moving back and forth as a messenger during the war. In 75, he joined a survey party that's in Kentucky, and he shows up a lot of times with James Harrod, who is one of the big leading explorers and surveyors from Virginia. Yeah, they found a town or a camp called Harrodsburg that they later reoccupy as a town. And Clark is living in Harrodsburg. In 1775, Chief Blackfish is using the opportunity of the conflict in the East to continue raiding into Kentucky. And so surveying parties start abandoning Kentucky left and right in 1775. But that lure of land is still there, so they aren't completely leaving. And in 1776,
Kentucky is an area with some competing land claims. North Carolina wants it, Virginia claims it, and Indigenous people are already in it. These claims make for a real political mess down the road. But in 1776, Clark saw an opportunity to shape his and Kentucky's future. Maybe he can take advantage of the discussion around land claims to secure some materials that settlers could use for defense.
Clark comes up with the idea to get help from Virginia. So he puts together this meeting. He's a very big guy. He's probably about 6'2", so he's about Washington's size. He's very charismatic. You find that when people are in his presence, he seems to be able to get them to do what he wants them to do. And he leads by example. He's not asking other people to do things he won't do himself. So he draws a lot of support, for lack of a better way to put it. He manages to secure gunpowder from Pittsburgh in 1776, gets it back to Harrodsburg, and suddenly a commodity that's in very short supply in Harrodsburg and in the Kentucky settlements is there because of George Rogers Clark. And so this sort of gives him a leading role in deciding or helping decide, direct the affairs of Kentucky in 1775, 1776.
These settlers on the frontier were basically like, we needed that gunpowder so badly that George Rogers Clark is our leader now. This trip accomplished more than just that. In Williamsburg, Clark gained access to Virginia's political elite, men like Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and George Mason. And he could now use those connections to push a larger agenda, bringing Kentucky formally under Virginia's authority. Because there were competing claims to the territory, there were factions among settlers in the area, with some supporting Virginia and others vying for North Carolina in control. Multiple speculation companies were also buying up the land, like Richard Henderson's Transylvania Company, who purchased land claims from the Cherokee and hoped to establish its own colony in the space. Clark's success persuading Virginia to provide gunpowder and support to Kentucky settlers strengthened the Virginia faction on the frontier and helped to tip the balance of power away from Henderson and the Transylvania Company. In 1776, Virginia even organized Kentucky as a county of Virginia. Gunpowder only solved part of the problem. Clark and other white settlers remained vulnerable to raids from indigenous nations, and frontier defenses were thin. Local militia efforts could respond to attacks, but rarely could stop them altogether. Clark became convinced that the real source of the problem lay beyond Kentucky itself. Many of the native groups opposing settlement were receiving support, supplies, and encouragement from British posts north of the Ohio River. If Kentucky was ever going to be secure, Clark reasoned, the settlers would have to strike at the source.
In 1776-77, Clark realizes that he's in charge of the militia in Kentucky, which is now a county in Virginia. The settlements there, primarily there's three of them. Harrodsburg, which is the biggest. Boonesboro, Daniel Boone fame, which owes its heritage back to Richard Henderson and the North Carolina Transylvania Company. And then a place called Logan Station or St. Asaph's. It gets all sorts of names over the course of its lifetime. And they're hanging on by their fingernails. They can't stop the raids. They live in kind of a situation where they're not self-supporting towns, all right? Your farms, your livestock, your house is outside of town walls. When there's information about a raiding party being in town, everybody goes inside the town walls, which is just a cheap frontier fort style, cheap vertical walls. And you're relatively safe during that period, but any raiding party can go off and burn your farms, kill your livestock, and so on, in which case you starve and you have to go back east with nothing. So they're really having trouble maintaining themselves. In 1777, Clark says this isn't going to do because we're entirely passive. We're reactive. The Indians have all the initiative. So what do? He says, I need to take the offensive. And he looks at a map and he goes, from Kentucky, we can attack Detroit, the British source of power in the West, or we can attack the Cherokee in the South. So he thinks Kentucky is a central position that he can use to influence the British or the Cherokee. He looks at this entire area and says, how can I attack the British? And so you don't have enough men to attack Detroit. I will invade the Illinois country. There's this little sliver of land in northwestern Illinois, probably about 2/3 of the state. And there's this little crescent along the Mississippi River on the east bank, and it's perfect farming land. So there have been French communities there for about 100 years. They're successful. They have good farms. They have, mills. Everything's going on. They have trade routes going up through the western upper Great Lakes down to New Orleans. Clark thinks that the British depend on these towns for their power. And if he can get at those towns, he can undermine the British position in Detroit and therefore secure Kentucky and then be of use to the war in the East.
Now Clark's going to head back east to Williamsburg and make his pitch to Virginia's governor, Patrick Henry.
And Patrick Henry is going to be convinced, along with the rest of the executive council, that, okay, we'll try this. Clark says he needs 500 men. Henry says, basically, we're going to get you 350, but you've got to raise them yourself. And you can't recruit east of the Appalachians because all the armed militia east of the Appalachians is needed for two things. One, to deal with the British if they show up, and two, to keep the enslaved population in control. So Clark has to recruit on the frontier. Clark probably breaks that rule, gets caught. Henry chews him out, and then he has to go back to the frontier. Now, he's expecting he can get a lot of men in Kentucky because people are moving into Kentucky. Unfortunately, the men he was counting on were with Daniel Boone, and they were all captured. So when he gets to Kentucky, there aren't any reinforcements there. So he's got about 150, 175 men at this point, and he's camped at a place called Corn Island, which is in the middle of the Ohio River, just opposite Louisville. And this is founding of the town of Louisville, because the people he leaves behind on Corn Island are eventually going to move just across a little channel to get into Kentucky. Remember, he says he needs 500 guys. He's only got 150 about this point. He had hoped to in Kentucky, and he recruited in Kentucky. He had an agent out there working for him there. But Daniel Boone went and got himself in a whole salt-making party captured. So there aren't a lot of men in Kentucky who are, because they're there a lot of times with their families. They aren't willing to just leave their families and go adventuring with George Rogers Clark. When he gets there, he meets the few reinforcements they can scrounge up and decides that he can't have them leave Kentucky either because they are needed now for the defense of Kentucky proper. The man the forts, chase Indian raiding parties, and so on.
Slight problem, though. It turns out these men didn't really realize they were signing up for more than just defending Kentucky.
So he gets 150 men together, and he's going to tell them at Corn Island that they all think they're there to defend Kentucky. He's going to tell them, we're not defending Kentucky. We're going to go all the way to Illinois and attack the British and their settlements out there. So he's sort of pulled a fast one in conjunction with Governor Henry, who knew exactly what was going to happen. With all these guys he's recruited from the frontier, which is going to be an interesting kind of thing. One company mutinies or goes AWOL. He picked Corn Island because he figured they'd be isolated, so they couldn't run away when he told them. But one company of men just skedaddled. He managed to catch a lot of them, bring them back, broke up the company. They hanged a couple of guys in effigy, but he catches enough of them that he feels comfortable going forward with what he's got.
It raises a question. How did this 20-something man from the frontier convince these men to sign up with him?
It's interesting. You can draw connections between sort of this desire for independence, not necessarily from Britain at this point, but to be masters of their own fate, I'll put it that way, rather than having to listen to far-off elites. Now, if you really pushed them on it, they'd probably tell you they're no more satisfied with elites in Williamsburg or Richmond than they are with elites in London. That these guys are going to be fiercely independent in general because this is their shop. This is where they believe they can make their futures for themselves and their families, which is not a pathway open to them in the East. Land's all owned by somebody. So there's that. You will find resolves, and Fort Gower resolves are famous for describing sort of that desire for independence early in the war. And these are some of the same kinds of people, if not the same people. For them, it's not about the war with Britain as much as it is about securing their futures, and Kentucky's the place to do it, and an American context is the best way for them to do it. But neither of these guys unaware of what, the preamble of the Declaration. They're not unaware of some of the resolutions coming out of the counties in the eastern part of Virginia. So they're not just going adventuring or mercenaries. They see themselves in a role where they can protect their future, their homes, their families, and secure for themselves a brighter future.
There was this idea, though, of not wanting to leave families behind, and for good reason.
They have a different personal problem on the frontier than they do in the East. The way the war shapes up and the way that frontier warfare is waged is there's not a distinction between combatants and non-combatants. So if you leave your home and you have a family, they're on their own. They'll work the farm as best they can, but they're not there for some things. And there's this worry that there's nobody around to defend them. I mean, when you walk out the door, you're taking your rifle and gunpowder with you. And what does that leave your wife and family? Not a lot. And because they are targets of frontier raids from Native Americans and British Rangers, that's an issue. So folks are not really eager to sign up to be away from home for long periods of time. This is a problem in Pennsylvania. It's a problem in Maryland. It's a problem in Virginia. They always have a problem with long-term recruits on the frontier. It's worse than the militia problem that Washington's always complaining about in the East, because the issue of security is much worse for frontier folks. So I think that's a dimension that's very different for the militia. Clark's guys are volunteers. They're not actually militia, because the militia is structured. When you call it a militia class, everybody's in the militia, right? When your number comes up, you have to go. Nobody had to go with Clark. He had to recruit volunteers. We're a little thin on data, but a lot of the guys who signed up with him in 1777 are young single men. This is a chance for them to dispense with their militia service, see the frontier. They may be avoiding some formal call-ups in the East that they just assume not go on to live, the hardy life on the frontier. And if they're just defending Kentucky, there's not necessarily a guarantee that they're going to get shot at, because those encounters tend to occur in isolation.
Another motivation, like what we covered in episode 1 of this season with Eric Schnitzer, was the prospect of land grants for service. Although Virginia never formally promised land to Clark's volunteers, leaders privately suggested that military service would be rewarded with acreage. Clark used those expectations to help recruit men.
When Henry and the Executive Council and then the Assembly finally signed off on the mission, there was no formal land grant in exchange for service at that point. There was a lot of sort of backroom talk about it. Not Henry, but it's George Mason, Thomas Jefferson, and I want to say Wythe. There's 3 of them that get together in a back room with Clark. And they tell him, tradition is, and certainly if we follow tradition, acreage would follow along with that. So he feels, because these are the power brokers, Clark feels comfortable telling his men that, there's always the possibility. And even if, there isn't, Kentucky's not very deeply or widely settled. So there is land here that you can procure through other means. Later, after this thing takes place, or in the course of the war, the convention is going to go ahead and say, okay, here's all these grants. They are considerably less than what Wythe and those guys promised, because basically all his volunteers now have to stay on for militia service, and their term is going to determine the amount of land they get. So they kind of get gypped in that they weren't made a formal promise. The informal promise wasn't fully kept, but they did have a right to claim lands as a result of it. And you're going to see those lands, I think, are in southwestern Ohio.
All of this is to say, the combination of Clark's charisma and the promise of land meant that Clark has the men he needs to carry out the mission. If it wasn't for charismatic Georges, where would this war be? Am I right? Clark has a fraction of the men that he wanted, but he's going to carry on with an honestly brilliant, if not somewhat crazy, idea. The British were spreading an idea that Americans in the region were bloodthirsty and brutal in an attempt to dissuade Native Americans and French settlers from working with the Americans. Clark is able to use this foundation of fear to his advantage, even if he doesn't actually have the manpower to back it up.
So Clark trains his men on Corn Island, and they're going to row the rest of the way down the Ohio, and they're going to get to a place called Cherokee Fort Massac, which is an abandoned French trading post on the Ohio. They're going to go overland to a town called Kaskaskia, which is the biggest town in this area of the American bottom, this little sliver of land where all these French people live. They're going to surprise that town in the middle of the night. They're going to use intimidation, threats of violence, and try to build this reputation for being bloodthirsty, scare the daylights out of the town, and eventually there'll be some give and take with a guy named Pierre Gibault, the town fathers. Gibault is a Jesuit priest. This is part of his charge, where Clark's going to tell him, I'm not going to do anything to you at all. You can keep your businesses, keep your families together, keep, worshiping in the Catholic Church. Nothing at all. You're going to be completely fine. All you have to do is sign an oath of loyalty to Virginia, which, by the way, you're living on our land, and the United States. And the town fathers, who were really terrified at this point, say, that's great. And they celebrate his coming with church bells. They have a big party. So he's going to do the same thing. He's going to send a guy named Joseph Bowman, who's one of his captains. His family's out from the Shenandoah Valley, and they're going to go out. They're going to roll up Prairie du Rocher, and then the next biggest town, which is Cahokia, which is roundabout underneath the East St. Louis Airport tarmac today. And they're going to use the same kind of approach. So surprise, intimidation, threats of violence, and so on, and then tell them, oh, just kidding. Yeah, we're really bad guys, but all you got to do is switch sides and everything's going to be good. You can keep doing what you're doing. We won't bother you. And I'll go for it. It's easy to change sides when there's a bunch of armed men in town. And then some of the French town fathers from Kaskaskia and Cahokia are going to go off and convince the people of another town, Vincennes, which is on the Wabash River and the western border of Indiana, to change sides. And the people in Vincennes, which is an important trading post, are also going to change sides. So he's going to seize control, as they say, of the Illinois country in a bloodless coup. Nobody's going to get hurt. Really what's happening is he's basically hauling down British flags from these ramshackle forts and putting up American flags in these ramshackle forts. And then the town militia, which has taken oaths of loyalty to the British, is essentially going to say, you're happy to take a different oath of loyalty to the Americans. We don't care. Doesn't matter. As long as you let us do what we want to do, it doesn't matter to us whose flag flies. So he conquers, as they say, unfortunately, the Illinois country that way. Again, it's kind of a neat trick with 150 people. There are Indians in the area, and if at any point the French and the Indians had decided to resist him, they probably could have wiped him out because he was outnumbered.
He gets to say, mission accomplished without any bloodshed. That's pretty wild. And while it's certainly an interesting story, it also has significant impact on the broader theater of the war.
So the guy in charge at Detroit is Lieutenant Governor Henry Hamilton. He's only one of 4 lieutenant governors that Quebec is supposed to have. And he's only one of 2 in post, which is interesting. He's probably the senior guy, has the most resources, and so on. He had been assembling a Native American army to attack Pittsburgh. And he had every reason to believe that was a good idea because Pittsburgh is pretty weak at this point. When he finds out that there are Americans in the Illinois country, he tells the governor, the guy named Frederick Haldimand, who's a Swiss soldier in the service of the British government. And Haldeman says, you got to go get it back. You can't take Pittsburgh. You got to go get it back. So the immediate impact is Hamilton has to change his plans, and essentially Pittsburgh is safe that year. The second thing is that Hamilton launches this large campaign from Detroit across Lake Erie, up the Maumee River, down the Wabash River, and it's quite a nightmare of a campaign, but it's very slow. He conducts massive amounts of Indian diplomacy, he hands a lot of gifts, trying to mobilize an Indian army. He succeeds. They show up in Vincennes. I think in Vincennes, there's probably about 20 guys in the fort, and like 17 of them are these Frenchmen who are really loyal, and they promptly change sides again, leaving Leonard Helm, who's a captain at this point, and like 4 other people he can count on in the fort. They surrender the fort. So Hamilton has been moved from attacking Pittsburgh to spending the winter of 1778, 79 in a little fort in the middle of nowhere in Vincennes on the Wabash. So that's interesting thing number 1. To complete the story with Clark, he finds out that Hamilton's in Vincennes. He can't stay where he is because he's worried that Hamilton will reassemble an Indian army and invade Kentucky in 1779. And there's probably every reason to expect him to do that. Certainly Hamilton has thought about it. He expected to continue campaigning in the spring of 79. So Clark decides to attack Vincennes and surprise Hamilton. And this is sort of where part of he gets this legend for much of the 1800s, as he marches his guys through the middle of February across Illinois in flooded countryside to surprise the fort in the middle of the night, attack it, and essentially get Hamilton to surrender. The tactics there are really fascinating from the standpoint of he's still using deception, surprise, building a reputation for ruthlessness, and basically bluffs Hamilton into surrendering. Hamilton surrenders the fort. Clark takes the fort, and now he's pretty well ensconced in the Illinois country. And he just happens to have, as a prisoner, a lieutenant governor of Quebec, who's good trade bait for later in the war. And he's also got a bunch of prisoners that he took from the Indians, and he's going to catch another British supply convoy coming down the Wabash to supply the fort, because they also don't know that Clark's taken it back. So that immediately military aspects, he's removed a short-term threat to Pittsburgh and achieved quite a diplomatic or a PR success. For Virginia, this is all undertaken under Virginia's auspices. This has nothing to do with Continental Army at this point.
With their successful campaign in 78 and 79 under their belts, Clark and his men will again see action in 1780 as a result of a British raid through the Illinois country.
So in 1780, they launch a two-pronged invasion of the Illinois country. They're attacking the Spanish in St. Louis at Fort St. Carlos and the Americans at Cahokia. Battle of Fort St. Carlos, the British lose, but they've been forced now to spend another campaign season attacking to recover the Illinois country, as opposed to mobilizing the resources to attack Pittsburgh. So there's a military effect there. There is an invasion of Kentucky in 1780 by the British and the Native American allies. It's successful. That leads to a punitive campaign in 1780 by Clark against the Shawnee. So from a military standpoint, his presence really does drive events in the West, and they reduce British freedom of movement and options when it comes to how they're going to wage war from Detroit.
He's been successful in terms of supporting American action during the war, but from a diplomatic standpoint, in terms of how he deals with Native Americans that he encounters, he's somewhat less successful as he goes on. And there's evidence of this in our collection. In 1779, Thomas Jefferson wrote to Clark with a directive to remove or eliminate Native Americans in the region. His original language was harsh. Jefferson stated, "I think the most important object which can be proposed with such a force is the extermination of those hostile tribes of Indians who live between the Ohio and Illinois, who have harassed us with eternal hostilities and whom experience has shown to be incapable of reconciliation. The Shawnees, Mingos, Munsees, and Wyandots can never be relied on as friends, and therefore the object of the war should be their total extinction, or their removal beyond lakes or the Illinois River, and peace." He later struck this out, but maintained specific instructions for elimination. In addition to the evidence of hostility in Jefferson's letter, there's another encounter that stands in stark contrast to past episodes of Clark using intimidation without violence.
There's an episode in that battle where a war party is returning to Vincennes. These are Native Americans with a British militia officer. They're coming back into Vincennes. It's customary when you approach a town or friendly town on the frontier, you fire your weapons off to announce your presence and demonstrate that you're not armed because you've fired off your weapons. So nobody gets surprised. So the Indians do that. Clark sees them, sends a company out to welcome them because there's a lull in the fighting, and these guys think that they don't realize that Clark's in town. So he sends a company out to basically meet these Native Americans coming back. When they get close enough, Clark's men fire their guns into the Indians, kill a bunch run away. They take a few Native American prisoners, rescue a few prisoners from Kentucky, and then later in the day, execute the Indian prisoners in full view of the fort. And these are really the only guys killed during Clark's 78, 79 campaign. They're executed in cold blood, relatively common occurrence, but that's always a controversial moment in Clark's career.
Clark was making treaties with Indigenous nations throughout his campaign, and Native nations reacted to his presence in a variety of ways. The American Revolution creates different stories for different groups. And for Indigenous individuals, it isn't all taxes and tea parties. It's the opportunity and threat of a new presence in their lands.
He does make a lot of peace treaties in the Illinois country, and he makes a lot of peace treaties with the Illinois confederations, the three nations, the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, and the Wea Nation. They're not engaged in the war, so they don't have a problem signing a peace treaty. He does become a factor when he's in Scottsdale, Illinois, for some of the Great Lakes Indians and some of the native tribes in eastern Illinois and western Indiana to consider, meaning they've got to deal with him now. Some of them can actually use that to their advantage vis-a-vis the British. Because the British were the only people supplying arms and gunpowder on the western frontier to them, they can use Clark's presence to basically cut a better deal with the British. They say, oh, you've got to give us more guns, more ammunition, more gunpowder because we've got to deal with Clark. And gee, if you don't, maybe we want to sign a peace treaty with him. So for them, it's another diplomatic option that they didn't have when it comes to their options for dealing with the war. That's really a function of their distance from the front. They're not threatened by Continental Army or militia. They can come and go from the war as they choose to. So for them, it's kind of perversely an advantage. In Ohio, it's a little bit different. They go on raiding into Kentucky, Western Virginia, and Pennsylvania. For them, it doesn't matter which one way or the other.
Ultimately, Clark succeeds in supporting the revolution, but falls a bit short in other ways.
Clark gets the great news in 1778 that despite all his efforts, Kentucky is still under attack and they've been worse than ever. So he hasn't achieved the goals he set out for himself, and that's probably because he misread the situation and what was possible with the forces he had at his disposal.
Truth be told, while his 1778 campaign may have contributed to a flood of settlers into Kentucky after 1779, at that point, the die had already been largely cast for American expansionism. His efforts in the West do deserve some credit, though.
It gives the Americans a claim on the West. Through most of historiography, especially through the 1800s, early 1900s, the traditional history is that, because Clark had done these things and, quote, conquered the Northwest, he secures the American frontiers out to the Mississippi, all this land for the Americans in the treaty negotiations. Honestly, that's a little bit of a stretch. It's not always supported by what you can find in the evidence, right? It's just sort of an assumption that people writing in the 1800s and early 1900s made. There's probably a little bit of truth to it. The British were ready to be done with the West. They actually withdrew all their troops in 1772. So from their standpoint, they had already kind of written it off. There wasn't a lot of harm in just leaving it written off. The Americans could say they had a claim, but even by 1782 and 1783, Virginia had kind of written off the West because they needed their resources, most of their money elsewhere. Virginia has kind of done the same thing to the West down near the Mississippi that the British had done. They've kind of just abandoned it and left it to its own devices. Whether it affected the outcome of the Treaty of Paris or not it probably didn't. The British probably would have withdrawn anyway because they just didn't want to mess with it anymore. They just needed a buffer to keep Canada, which is why they kept Detroit and some other areas. That was their issue. And as we learned in the course of the campaigns, he couldn't threaten Canada from Illinois or Kentucky. Not yet. That comes later.
We've drawn some comparisons between George Rogers Clark and George Washington. Charismatic 20-somethings with goals to raise their standing. But the similarities in their stories end with the war. Washington emerges a leader and successful politician whose wartime actions are only the beginning of his long legacy. Clark, on the other hand, was not so lucky.
It is a very sad story for him. So while he's charismatic in person, he's not a very nuanced thinker. He's not a very good politician. While he's off fighting the war, the population of Kentucky explodes, and other people who are a little bit better educated, more sophisticated, and in Kentucky basically are taking control of the county. So he doesn't really have a role in Kentucky anymore. He's in charge of the Kentucky militia. But what that means is that he gets blamed for everything that goes wrong. And securing Kentucky the way that they wanted to be secured is impossible in the 1770s. So he gets blamed for everything. In the course of doing his campaigns and running his war, he's been getting stuff from the French. And he's been signing notes. Basically, we'll pay for this. We being Virginia. Virginia refuses to honor his debts. So now he's bankrupt because the people in those towns still want to get paid. They provided the goods and services. So now he's bankrupt. He eventually sort of moves back to the Louisville area. He founds a town called Clarksville, which is in Indiana. There's a great state park there at the Falls of the Ohio. There used to be a little cabin, which was sort of made to where a place where he had lived. But he starts drinking pretty heavily. And it turns out he's an alcoholic with nothing to do. He just drinks a lot. He's living alone. And as he ages, the big, charismatic, strapping, healthy guy that he was in his 20s, just that guy goes to pot. And he really, for lack of a better way to put it, goes to seed. And he can't get anything done. He's a lousy businessman. Now he's an alcoholic. He can't pay his bills still. So he's kind of living in poverty. He's very proud of Clarksville, which is growing. He does own land, not a lot. And he has a stroke, loses a leg. He falls into a fire, has another stroke, moves in with his sister and her husband across the river. There's a frontier plantation, which is called Locust Grove. And Clark ends up sort of living one of their front rooms as kind of a ward because he's had these strokes and he's really not able to do anything other than sort of sitting in front of fire and drinking. And he eventually dies in debt. Just kind of a wreck of a man. He's not got a good reputation because he's been drunk for a while and he hasn't paid his bills.
A century after Clark's lifetime, his story was revisited. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, some historians painted him a hero and a conqueror of the West.
So the frontier closes, right? You know, you get the whole notion that, we're a frontier-defined country, and now it's closed, and what do we look to for our heroes? And you get this triumphal spirit in America. I would call it American triumphalism, okay? So late 1800s, Americans are feeling like they're at the top of the world, and they need now to create their own mythology. And this is where you start to get Daniel Boone really becomes famous. It's where Simon Kenton becomes famous. It's where a lot of these guys who were on the frontier back in the 1700s, you have their reputations built. Teddy Roosevelt, always eager to build a little bit of the triumphal notion, calls Clark the conqueror of the Northwest. And this kind of sticks among a lot of folks. And you get these boys' stories where they're identifying people on the frontier to teach young men the spirit of manliness and all this other stuff. So they kind of settle on him to build this reputation, and they forget about all the drunkenness and all the other stuff that comes later in life, and they just look at this feat of the 1778-79 campaign, which is really remarkable that he pulled it off. And that becomes the story, and that sticks for probably about through the 40s or 50s. We had Daniel Boone as a TV show on the Disney Channel, or on Disney, right? It's all nonsense, but that was the story, and Clark fits in that tradition, or did for a long time.
By the end of the 20th century, his legacy was shifting again.
So you had this triumphal version of American history, right? Where it's supposed to inspire people and all this other stuff, but it wasn't strictly true, right? It wasn't accurate. So now you get this reaction in the 20th century where people are going back and looking at these first-person accounts and digging a little deeper and finding out that the myths don't hold up. And you find out that, yeah, he was a racist. He did own people. He had committed these cold-blooded murders in 1779. He'd done all these horrible things. He'd run a campaign of retribution against the Shawnee in 1780. And, these things are horrible. So I call it a reaction to this triumphal version, which was ridiculous. It's caricature. Now we get the caricature the other way. When they were taking down the Confederate statues in Charlottesville, there was one of Clark because that's where he was born in Albemarle County. And it's sort of the very triumphal version of Clark. And there's a supine Indian, I think, at his feet. He's on his horse and pointing the way west or something like that.
Clark's statue was removed in 2021 alongside the removal of Confederate monuments. Clark's campaign was an audacious attempt to secure Virginia's claims in the West and force British officials to divert resources away from other theaters of the war. His Illinois campaign helped advance the American cause in the West, and its legacy, alongside Clark's own personal history, is complex with lasting consequences. Thanks so much to Eric Sterner for sharing his insights on today's episode. Join us next time as we enter the shadowy world of spies for a look at espionage in the American Revolution.
Thanks for listening to Revolution Revisited. The American Revolution was not an ending, but a beginning. The stories continue to unfold. Subscribe now and catch the next episode for another journey through history. This podcast is made possible by William and Karen Fralin and presented by the Virginia Museum of History and Culture.
explore 16,000 years of Virginia history. The Virginia Museum of History and Culture offers a variety of exhibitions, public programs, and special events for the whole family. Learn more and plan your visit at virginiahistory.org.